Okay, we're going to do a Latin America update today. I know all of you are riveted to the bullshit that's happening with the Senate and Brett Kavanaugh and blah, blah, blah. But there are other things going on in the world. So, this from the Tico Times, which, by the way, is actually a pretty good publication from Costa Rica. And I say that because it's kind of more of not it's not really politically oriented. It's more towards just reporting regional news in Central America. By the way, in English. So if you don't want to comb through like newspapers like La Prensa or any of the other Spanish language publications from down there, Tico Times is pretty good. And it says Epsy Campbell asked the United Nations to intervene in Nicaragua. This is the vice president of Costa Rica. And I don't know what that would mean. I don't know what the United Nations can do in the internal situation in Nicaragua. So, Vice President Epsy Campbell said Thursday at the UN that the situation in Nicaragua is not sustainable and called on the international community to help solve the crisis with the potential of growth with impacts all over Central America. When it comes to the life and dignity of people, to their chance of living free of fear and misery, the silence makes us all accomplices, she said from the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. That is why Costa Rica raises its voice, she said, expressing her preoccupation regarding the disrespect of the rule of law and the violations of the human rights in Venezuela. I don't know why. I thought the focus was here on Nicaragua. Maybe they made a mistake, but it could be that she was referring to both countries. Campbell said that the deterioration of the institution and of the institutionalization and the systemic erosion of the human rights in Nicaragua requires worldwide attention. For this reason, she suggested that the international community and the UN General Secretary participate with a preventive diplomacy and help mediate the crisis. The massive protests that erupted in Nicaragua 5 months ago against President Daniel Ortega has resulted in more than 320 deaths and 2,000 injured in the midst of a violent repression. Campbell noted an increase of migration and refuge applications of Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, emphasizing a responsible, orderly, and solidary answer from Costa Rica. But of course, Costa Rica cannot carry this weight alone, she said. The situation in Nicaragua is not sustainable. Thousands of Nicaraguans have fled to neighbor countries, especially to Costa Rica, where at least 23,000 have already sought asylum. For Campbell, only the path of committed, effective dialogue between the two parties with a serious agreement and an agenda of democratization can be a solution for the conflict that distresses the brotherland. The dialogue in Nicaragua, mediated by the Catholic Church and started May 16th, has been paralyzed since the middle of June. This is due to the government's violent repression of protests and refusal to accept democratization measures, including early elections. And so there's one commenter that says, "Would it have been better if Oliver North was left to finish the job?" So I want to say this comment, and there's not a lot of news coming out of Nicaragua currently because I believe with all of the things that happened in the spring and over the summer, the situation there has stabilized, but it has not gotten better. I'll explain what I mean by that. There are no massive public disturbances as there were during the months between like April and I believe August, when Nicaraguan citizens started to object to an accumulation of social issues that Daniel Ortega had allowed to basically erode the trust in the government of Nicaragua. And the reason is that the crackdown has succeeded. Nicaragua, for the time being at least, Nicaragua has been able to enforce basically a climate of complacence because a lot of people who were most willing to go out and show their displeasure against Ortega, or let's be honest, some of the violent people too. A lot of those people, whether the violent or non-violent opponents of Ortega, have fled the country. And who are left? A lot of the people that simply are not in a position where they want to risk, whatever they have, whether it's like, just meager subsistence living, or their job or whatever it is. So this happens very often when there's an authoritarian crackdown in many countries. This happened in Zimbabwe, by the way, over and over again under Robert Mugabe. And the reason is that you do get these governments that are so authoritarian that all the power is concentrated in the executive branch, and eventually it becomes so concentrated that yes, civil society becomes basically incapable of overthrowing the dictator. Yes, there are cases where for example, the Marcos regime in the Philippines was overthrown in a popular revolution, but it's not as if that happens literally every time that an authoritarian leader, uh, you, you know, cracks down on his opponents. There are plenty of examples. Tiananmen Square. There have been attempts to protest in Vietnam, where unfortunately people who demand a more free public space, they don't get any they don't get to see their day in the sun. Okay, they don't get their moment in the sun. Uh, I've seen a lot of posting back and forth concerning what's happening in Hong Kong right now, which is the Hong Kong residents. A lot of them are calling for a return to the British administration of Hong Kong that prevailed before 1997. And I know somebody who, I'm not going to mention his name, who says, well, that's ridiculous because under the British, yes, society was more free. Socially, the colony was much more free, but it was still a British possession. So they replaced one repressive system that was repressive in a different way with a different repressive system. The Chinese repressive system. So they're not really protesting in favor of something that has actual that will actually bring more freedom to the island, to the Hong Kong island, and well, the Hong Kong territory, I guess you would call it. Not all of Hong Kong is an island. There is Kowloon. So before we get too sidetracked, why is Costa Rica bringing this to the UN? It's not now. Some people would say, and I'm not going to mention names, but some people would say that this is Costa Rica basically doing its part as an imperialist puppet in order to overthrow the democratically elected government of Daniel Ortega. And Ortega was elected, I believe, 2 times democratically in the his current term in office. But that's not why. The reality is that what Nicaragua is doing is upsetting the balance of social order within the region. The issues that for example, his whole decision on the Chinese Canal, which nobody's willing to talk about, that's not something that people should have to argue about on the right and left. When you basically agree to have a foreign country build a massive canal across the entire interior of your country, through people's land, and possibly through nature reserves, people have the absolute right to object. Okay, and that created a lot of social disorder. And I would say that the canal and Ortega's seizing of more power and appointing and having his wife serve as vice president, and a collection of economic issues and the lack of subsidized Venezuelan oil, all of that has given rise to that political and economic crisis in his country. And then that led to this shockwave due to the migration into countries like Costa Rica, which is not a very large country. And they have to do what they can do in order to look after the interests of their own citizens. Costa Rica is not responsible for absorbing the failures of the Nicaraguan government. Just like I believe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had a chat with Elena McCarthy. We were talking about how there's an article in Deutsche Welle, which is a German English language publication, and they were claiming that Brazil was full of xenophobia towards fleeing Venezuelan refugees. I said, this has nothing to do with xenophobia. I don't believe that the people of Brazil have, they really have a long-standing hatred of Venezuelans. Maybe there is something, but the reason that there was a backlash against these Venezuelan refugees, who I believe are also, unfortunately, the victims of a huge human tragedy, is because people won't acknowledge that the governments of failed countries, and we're going to get to Venezuela, possibly after this video, if not tomorrow. The issue with Venezuela is that the government there has basically abdicated its responsibility to have the country succeed in the name of pursuing some sort of bizarre economic war that they think will create social equality. Well, in reality, it's created a more fractured society, and it's fractured between the people that are destitute and remain in Venezuela and the people who are very poor and have fled Venezuela, or there's people who fled earlier and they're a lot richer. So everything that Maduro has done, everything that he's enacted in Venezuela, as well as what Chavez did, has been a complete failure. And then you're going to blame the Brazilian civilians that object to this migrant crisis. You're going to call them the xenophobes because they're bearing the brunt of Maduro's failures and Chavez's failures. I anticipate, it could be a while down the road, but they'll start calling this woman Epsy Campbell, who I don't know much about, but they'll start calling her stuff, basically xenophobic and intolerant towards these Nicaraguan refugees. There wouldn't have been any refugees if Ortega would have run his country like a normal person instead of basically reversing all of the democratic reforms of the 90s. So please like this video, share it, comment on it when it uploads, as well as subscribe to the channel and subscribe to my other channel, Razor Ray Live Wounds, which is for live streaming. And I will talk to you later, and have a great night.